Hello Internet and welcome to a new tutorial. So Arturia just released the Tape G37 emulation, and to my surprise it's far from being just another tape saturation or saturation box. In this tutorial I want to show you how I've actually used it in a track that I've just finished, sent to the label. It's ready for release, and why as a Psytrance and electronic music producer you should be using it in your mixes. So think of this tape emulation as a coloration box. It's a plugin you're going to use to polish your sounds and give them character. And you're going to do so by applying saturation. You have 4 different saturation kinds in here. Basically they are 4 different tape emulations and 2 global saturation mode, basically modern and old. So you have all in all 8 saturation types. And just like the OG Sound Toys Decapitator, you don't need to add any drive to color the sound. Just the fact that you've chosen, I don't know, this tape saturation in here with the modern setting, for example, it's going to alter the sound. Of course, I'm going to show you some examples later on. Next, there's the speed parameter, and think of it as some sort of a lo-fi knob. So the 7.5 will give you more of a lo-fi vibe. It's going to add a low-pass filter basically on the high end and alter a little bit the saturation curves. Honestly, for my music, I don't see the point because it makes it way too dark and kind of like lo-fi, and I make more of like a digital sharp sounds. So yeah, that's a bit too much. 15 is really good for me. And then there's this transport button. You don't really use it to color the sound. This is more of an effect. Basically, when you hit stop, it's going to give you this tape stop effect. So yeah, technically you can use the G37 emulation as a master effect if you want this tape stop kind of effect, and you can choose the duration of this stop time from a quarter of a bar to 8 bars, and the start mode can be instant or fast forward. You can create some really nice kind of like tape vibe with it if this is what you're looking for in your tracks. And just like any of Arturia's plugins, there's the advanced button here that will give you access to more advanced parameters that you can play with and alter the sound with. So starting with the EQ, really simple, high shelf, low shelf, and a bell in here. But what's really interesting about it is that you can apply it to pre or post saturation or emphasize, which is inside of the saturation. So this will give you way more control over the saturation curve and the coloration you're adding to the sound. It's really interesting. I'm going to show you how I use it in action later on. Next, there's the calibration. This adds flutter and wow effect to the sound. Think of it this way. It's going to apply a little bit of pitch modulation and amp modulation on the left and right channel separately. So you're going to add a really nice stereo image to your sounds. And you can also add noise to emulate that analog mojo of a tape machine. But for me and for my sounds, this is a bit too much, so honestly, I've never used it since I got this plugin. And to finish the advanced tab, there's a delay unit in here. Pretty straightforward. You can set the timing in here either in milliseconds, or you can sync it to your DAW and go in time divisions basically. You can control the feedback. There's a high pass and low pass filtering on the delay, and you can offset the left and right channel basically to create some sort of a ping pong. So that was a quick overview of this tape emulation. Now let's hear it in action and see what it can do in a track. Now, as I mentioned, the main use of this tape emulation for me is to polish my sounds and give them some character. So I have this FM lead in here. It sounds like this. Right? What I did with it, I've wanted to add some grit. So I've added some saturation using the very first tape in here, gave it like 20 dB of drive, which is pretty generous. So now we have this. But as you can hear, it kind of killed the high end of this lead. So what I did, I turned on the EQ in here, set it to post mode, gave it a little bump on the 800 region just to give it some warmth, because when I've added the high shelf at about 3K and gave it 5.6 dB of gain, the sound became a bit too bright. So that's here to compensate the brightness basically. So before we had this. So you can hear the coloration added to the sound. And next, I've wanted to add some stereo image to the sound because it's mono, it's way too centered, and I wanted to take a bit more space in the stereo field. So I've turned on the calibration in here, and I've added about 20% of wow and flutter effect basically. So now we have this. You can hear how the sound started moving in the stereo field, and it gave it this really nice stereo image, which is not exaggerated, but just gave it what the sound needed to fill up a little bit more space, right? So before we had this, and after we had this. Difference like night and day. And now in the full mix with the full processing of the lead, we'll get this. So just to put you in context, without it, we had this. A huge difference, and it just took us like a minute to set up and get that sound from it. I'm really impressed by what this tape emulation is capable of doing. And by the way, if you want to dive more into my mixing process, I've just released my sequencing and arrangement masterclass. You can check it out on my Gumroad. Now, I like to think of this tape emulation as some sort of a glue compressor, because technically saturation is compression. And because we're applying some really interesting saturation curves to the audio signal that we have, we can get some really nice gluing effect out of this tape machine. Check this out. I have these drums for my intro. They sound like this without the tape emulation. But I felt that these drums needed more gluing and some coloration. They sounded a bit too clean to my taste. At least in the context of this track, I wanted it to sound gritty. So what I did, I took the tape G37 emulation, of course, turned it on. I've set the coloration here to the first tape, this one, the pristine one. I gave it a generous amount of saturation, 34 dB. And before the EQing, listen to this, we got this result. Right before we had this. Hear how the snare got glued with the rest of the drums? But now the kick is saturating way too much the signal, right? It's hitting the saturation or the tape way too hard. So what I did, I turned on the EQ in here. And with the low shift that I've set to 95 Hertz, I took it about 8 dB down, but I've set the mode to emphasize. So it's EQing within the saturation. And now, check what we will get. A way cleaner result. Without it, we had this. Hear how the kick was saturating way too much, and with it, we kept the coloration, but we didn't overdo it on the kick side. And now with the full mix, we will get these drums. Without it, we had this. Hear how the drums now just cut way better through the mix. And all it took us is just a generous amount of saturation, a little bit of corrective EQing. It's honestly like magic. I really love what this plugin is doing. So now that we've seen how to use this tape emulation as a coloration box to polish the sound, give it some character, and how to use it as a glue compressor basically, how about we put it on the master lead bus and use it to do exactly these two jobs, polish the sound and glue things together. Check this out. Without it, we have this. And what I did in here, I've used the grittiest or the dirtiest tape emulation they have, the fourth one, the red one in here. I gave a little bit of drive, like 10 dB of drive. Of course, I've compensated in here with the master output. I've added a little bit of EQing because I felt my leads are a bit too bright. They've needed a tiny bit of warmth. So I've added a little bump in here, like 2 dB on the 800 region. I've set the EQ to post, and I've added a little bit of wow and flutter effect, like just 9%, nothing too exaggerated. And now I have this. Check this out. Focus on the melodic lead. Without it, we had this. Let's hear it in solo. And with it, I don't know if this will go through YouTube's compression, but it just add a tiny bit of character to the sound. Just makes it a bit more alive, especially with this little wow and flutter effect. So all in all, we have this. And yeah, with this is the end of this tutorial. I really hope you've liked it. I really hope you've learned something new. If you'd like to support the channel, consider becoming a Patreon, leaving a like, comment, subscribe. Things like that helps the channel a lot. And if you want to learn more about my sequencing, arrangement, and mixing techniques, check out my freshly released masterclass on sequencing and arrangement on my Gumroad. And I'll see you in the next one.